Please consider becoming a patron of MythVision podcast. You'll get early access to every video, including this amazing one, and you can ask me personal questions, private message me, anything you'd like. Professor Joel Baden. I've got a good friend, Michael Baca. He's a patron member of MythVision, and he says, for Dr. Baden, I read a book by Thomas Romer titled The Invention of God. In the book, he implies that European scholars don't accept the documentary hypothesis anymore, on page 8 of the book. It seems that there are two aspects of the hypothesis. The notion that there are 4 distinct documents, and when and where and how they were integrated into the Pentateuch. Could it be this second aspect that Dr. Romer and apparently other European scholars might have questions about? Thank you for your answer. I realize that this is a very complex topic.
Yeah, it is a complex topic, obviously, but I think I can do this pretty easily. And I don't remember if we talked about this last time, right? I talk a lot about documentary hypothesis and about the JEPD sources and about, how they were put together, because I think that is the simplest and most coherent explanation for why the text looks the way it does. It's not the only explanation for why the text looks the way it does. And, there's a school of scholarship predominantly in continental Europe, though with, folks here and there all over the place, that has moved away from the documentary theory and has moved towards a different theory. Now, again, and I'm happy to explain it, as best I can. This isn't really, it's not a question of who's right and who's wrong. Right? And actually, I think there are parts of both that we have over time sort of interwoven into each other's ideas because they're compelling in various ways. But none of this is right. None of this is fact, right? Everything we're doing here is right? It's called a hypothesis, documentary hypothesis, right? It's theory, right? How do we best explain what we're seeing? For me, the best explanation is this. For others, the best explanation might be that, and then we put those things out there in the world and let people decide what they think makes the best sense, right? Until we discover, right, a copy of the document in a cave somewhere, please, right? Until that happens, we're only gonna be talking about probabilities and not about, sort of truth or facts. So fine, which is what the humanities is all about anyway. So the idea is, not that the Pentateuch is a combination of 4 originally independent documents that were interwoven like this, which is what I think, but that what we had instead were sort of smaller stories or collections of stories that sort of grew over time. And so instead of 4 things separately that were put together, more like a few things that kind of expanded and sort of accumulated into the larger mass, and then just kept layers and layers and layers on top of that. So the example that sort of that branch of scholarship started with, that I still think is a really good one, is what we're going to do is we're going to take the stories and reduce them to what do we think the core stories really are here. So there's the Pentateuch, and obviously there's the patriarchal stories within the Pentateuch. And within the patriarchal stories, there's 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So those are each separate things. And then so let me focus on Jacob for a second. There's a bunch of stuff that goes on with Jacob in his story. There's, Jacob's got the whole thing, thing with Esau, right? The whole rivalry with Esau. There's the whole thing where he goes on a trip to his family out in Aram and gets married and all the stuff out there, which has nothing, Esau's not involved in that at all, right? Those seem to be totally separate things, traditions that take place in totally separate places. There's the whole tradition of Jacob founding a cultic site at Bethel, right? That's Jacob's ladder whole thing. None of them seem to really have much to do with each other. right? They're all part of Jacob's story, but they are located in different places, right? You can imagine that a tradition of Jacob founding a cultic site or a sanctuary at the town of Bethel, it could be its own little story that emerged from Bethel, right? And the whole story of Jacob and Esau could be, like a different story about why, in this case, why are we so similar to these people who we call Edomites over there in the south, and what's our relationship to them? And okay, so, and I agree to the extent that these seem to be different traditions about Jacob, and I do think they probably emerged in different places for different purposes. For those who don't agree with the documentary hypothesis, what they'll say is, okay, so I assume that these traditions were actually like texts, right? Like, don't talk to me about Jay. Talk to me about the Jacob and Esau story. Like, that's the text I want to think about. And they look at the Bible and they sort of they're like, okay, this is the Jacob and Esau story. Here's the verses that constitute it. Here's the Jacob at Bethel story. Here's the Jacob and Lavan story right up in Aram, where he's, the whole thing with the sheep and the wives and stuff. I can isolate those as stories, and then I'll say, okay, so this must have existed independently, and then somebody combined them. How did they combine them? Well, here's all the places where their stories are linked. So when Jacob shows up at Bethel, God says, right, I'll protect you on your journey that you're taking. So, okay, reference to a journey, that seems to connect the Bethel stuff with the Jacob fleeing. Why is Jacob going up to get married? Oh, it's because he's running away from Esau. That's a connection, right? That's not an original part. That's like something that's meant to link these originally independent pieces together. How did Jacob get linked with Abraham? Somebody introduced this theme of the patriarchal promise, right? The blessing, right? Like that goes overarching all of the different patriarchs, and now they're genetically related, and it grows and builds like that. So you had independent little stories that accumulated into coalesced into the broader Jacob tradition that then was combined with the broader Abraham tradition that had its own little history, and then those patriarchs were combined with the bigger Exodus tradition, and now you've got a whole story, right? So this is, and again, there is something compelling about this, and in fact, I think it makes a lot of sense to my mind, on the level of oral tradition, right? This is how stories grow. To my mind, it's not how texts on papyrus grow, right? Or on parchment, right? It's a little hard for me to imagine, a story about Jacob at Bethel that existed as an independent text, right? It's like somebody was going around being get your copies of the Jacob. That's not how it worked, but a Jacob at Bethel story that has no connection to anything else is 5 lines long. I'm not sure where that exists in the world, in the real world. But the notion that these traditions were independent and this is how we got our Jacob story, sure. That makes sense to me. But in any case, I don't want to take the time to argue against that perspective. I just want to be able to introduce it as the other major possibility in scholarship. So to my mind, right, all of the sources that make up the Pentateuch had basically the full story already sort of predetermined for them by oral tradition, right? And this is just the story that everybody in Israel could tell with all of its variations of their own early history. And J had its version, and E had its version, and P had its version, and and then they each told them themselves, and then they were all brought together. The other alternative, as I'm trying to suggest, is there was really only one version, right? And it's just that over time it kept getting reshaped and growing, so that what I would call E's version of the Jacob story isn't really. It's not a separate source. It's just a slightly different. Somebody expanded the material a little bit. So yeah, it's the difference between sources that went like this and layers that went like this, and that's those are the two big approaches. And again, I find the source approach more compelling. I think it explains the evidence better, on pretty much every level. And you can see my rebuttal to the other approach. It's in my composition of the Pentateuch book. I've got a whole bunch of pages about why I don't think that works. But out there in the world, so when you pick up Thomas Romer's book and you find we don't think that, this is what they think instead for the most part, in very broad terms.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.